The humidity in the courtroom today felt different. It wasn't the usual stifling summer heat, it was the pressure of an impending storm. The gallery was packed, but the usual murmuring was gone, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. I walked to my bench, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the stale coffee of the clerks or the floor wax. It was the metallic tang of pure, unadulterated fear. I've sat on this bench for decades, handling everything from petty squabbles to high-stakes family disputes, but the air in this room told me this day would be a turning point. Officer Byrd stood by his station. He wasn't leaning against the wall or scanning the room with his usual casual confidence. He was rigid, his shoulders braced, and his eyes were locked on the double doors at the back of the courtroom. He gave me that subtle look, the one that said, "Watch your back, Judge." I adjusted my robe, sat down, and scanned the docket. Case number 82, the State versus Julian Varga. When the doors opened, the oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. Julian Varga didn't walk. He sashayed, flanked by two armed bailiffs who looked more like bodyguards than court security. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that screamed wealth and privilege, his hair perfectly coiffed, a smirk plastered on his face as if he were walking down a red carpet. He was the son of Hector Varga, the man who effectively ran the underground narcotics trade from the border up to the northeast. I watched him approach the table. He didn't look at the plaintiff, a woman clutching her seat, sobbing quietly. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked straight at me, his eyes dead, cold, and devoid of human respect. He pulled out his chair and sat down, crossing his legs like he owned the courthouse. I felt the familiar spark of righteous fury ignite in my gut. I don't care who your father is, what country he rules, or how many millions you have. In my courtroom, you are a litigant, and you will behave like one. Mr. Varga, I began, my voice clear and cutting through the tension. You are here to answer for the destruction of private property and reckless endangerment. I suggest you remove your sunglasses before I find you in contempt of my courtroom. He took his time, slowly peeling the glasses off, his grin widening. My eyes are sensitive to the light, Judge, he drawled, his voice a smooth, venomous velvet. I'm sure you can make an exception for a guest of my stature. I didn't blink. I didn't let him occupy an inch of my authority. You are not a guest. You are a defendant. And in this house, there are no exceptions. The glasses go on the table, or you go into a cell. I don't care how sensitive your eyes are, but you're about to be very sensitive to the reality of incarceration if you test me again. The room froze. Varga's smile didn't fade, but his eyes narrowed. He tossed the sunglasses onto the table with a clatter. It was on. The humidity in the courtroom today felt different. It wasn't the usual stifling summer heat. It was the pressure of an impending storm. The gallery was packed, but the usual murmuring was gone, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. I walked to my bench, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the stale coffee of the clerks or the floor wax. It was the metallic tang of pure, unadulterated fear. I've sat on this bench for decades, handling everything from petty squabbles to high-stakes family disputes. But the air in this room told me this day would be a turning point. Officer Byrd stood by his station. He wasn't leaning against the wall or scanning the room with his usual casual confidence. He was rigid, his shoulders braced, and his eyes were locked on the double doors. He gave me that subtle look, the one that said, "Watch your back, Judge." I adjusted my robe, sat down, and scanned the docket. Case number 82, the State versus Julian Varga. When the doors opened, the oxygen seemed to vanish. Julian Varga didn't walk. He sashayed, flanked by two armed bailiffs who looked more like bodyguards than court security. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that screamed wealth, his hair perfectly coiffed, a smirk plastered on his face, as if he were walking down a red carpet. He was the son of Hector Varga, the man who effectively ran the underground narcotics trade. I watched him approach the table. He didn't look at the plaintiff, a woman clutching her seat, sobbing quietly. He looked straight at me, his eyes dead and devoid of human respect. He pulled out his chair and sat down, crossing his legs like he owned the courthouse. I felt the familiar spark of righteous fury ignite in my gut. I don't care who your father is. In my courtroom, you are a litigant. Mr. Varga, I snapped. I am not here to play games. Mrs. Higgins, proceed. Tell the court why you are suing this young man for $8,000. Mrs. Higgins, a soft-spoken woman whose hands shook, cleared her throat. Your Honor, He's been terrorizing the neighborhood. It started with loud music at 3 a.m. Then, the graffiti on our garage doors. But last Tuesday, he drove his SUV through my garden, right over my husband's memorial rose bushes. He looked me in the eye, laughed, and told me that if I called the police again, I'd regret living in this zip code. My blood went cold. Threats. The kind of threats that usually lead to police protection. I looked back at Varga. He was checking his watch, the picture of indifference. "Mr. Varga," I said, my voice dangerously low. "You heard the plaintiff. Do you deny this?" He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "I don't keep track of where I drive, Judge. If she didn't want her flowers crushed, she should have built a wall. You have a right to move, not to terrorize," I shot back. "This isn't a board game where you get to destroy property because you're bored, is it?" Varga leaned forward, his grin sharpening. "Because it feels like a stage for an old woman who hasn't realized her time in the spotlight is over. My father handles problems with real solutions. You? You just shout. Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" The courtroom grew deathly still. The "do you know who I am" card? It was the calling card of the dangerous and the delusional. "I don't care if you're the son of the devil himself," I said, my voice echoing. "In my courtroom, you're just another defendant who can't follow the rules. Officer Bird, if he interrupts again, you know what to do." Bird's eyes locked onto Varga with terrifying intensity. "Understood, Judge." Varga shifted, his bravado wavering, but he quickly regained his smirk. "My father doesn't like being talked about like this. Accidents happen, Judge. People often find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time." The threat was veiled, yet sharp. I felt the cold, familiar focus of a fight. I wasn't going to let him intimidate me. I looked at the reports of the ruined garden. "Well, Mr. Varga," I said, tossing the papers onto the desk, "it seems your father's solutions have worked well for you so far, but today, you're not in your father's jurisdiction, you're in mine." The room was stifling, the kind of heat that makes tempers fray and patience wear thin. I looked down at Mrs. Higgins, who was clutching a thin manila envelope. "Is there any other evidence, ma'am?" I asked, my voice cutting through the tension. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Varga, who was looking at the ceiling with an air of profound boredom. "The local police. They wouldn't take it, Your Honor. They said they were too busy and that it was a civil dispute. They were scared. But I kept copies. I kept everything." She handed the envelope up to the bench. I opened it. High-resolution photos. Clear, crisp, and undeniable. Varga was in his charcoal gray SUV, grinning behind the wheel as he drove straight through the memorial rose bushes. In one photo, his phone was visible. He was recording the act, documenting the destruction for his own amusement. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a performance. "Evidence," I muttered, my voice tight. I slid the photos across the bench. They landed face up in front of Varga. "Does this look like the wrong place at the wrong time, Mr. Varga? Or does this look like premeditated, malicious vandalism?" Varga didn't even glance down. He leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight, his eyes mocking me. "It's a digital file, Judge. Easily manipulated, filtered, and edited. My father's team could prove those are AI-generated fakes in under 5 minutes. You're holding onto a fantasy. It's a cute story, but it won't hold up in a real court. And it certainly won't hold up in the world my family operates in." I looked at Bird. He was stiff, his jaw clenched, his hand never straying far from his belt. I knew that look. He wasn't just guarding me. He was waiting for the moment things went south. "Mr. Varga," I said, leaning forward until I was just inches from the microphone, "do you enjoy wasting my time? Because I have a backlog of people who actually want to resolve their disputes, not turn my courtroom into their personal playground. I enjoy watching people realize they're powerless, Judge," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hiss. "You think that gavel makes you a queen? You're just an old woman sitting in a wooden box, surrounded by people who are terrified of what happens when the cameras turn off." The courtroom felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in. Varga's phone buzzed on the defense table. He didn't answer it, but he glanced at the screen, and for a split second, that smug mask slipped. His expression shifted into something predatory, a look of genuine, cold anticipation. "You see that, Judge?" he whispered, tilting his head toward the phone. "That's a live feed. Not of this courtroom, of your chambers. My associates are very efficient. They don't just destroy rose bushes. They clear space for new beginnings. Are you sure you want to proceed with this verdict?" The air in the room didn't just feel heavy, it felt electrified. Every eye in the gallery was on me, waiting to see if the great Judge Judy would blink. The threat was clear, and it was personal. He thought he had me checkmated. He thought the law ended where his money began. He had no idea what he had just walked into. "Mr. Varga," I said, my voice ice cold, "you just threatened a judge on the record. Do you have any idea how much you've just increased your sentence?" I looked at him, not with fear, but with the weary patience one reserves for a petulant child. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Varga sat there, leaning back with that same insufferable, predatory smirk, convinced he had just played the winning hand. He thought the mention of my chambers, the invasion of my private space, would be the catalyst that sent me into a panic. He was wrong. "A live feed, Mr. Varga?" I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "You think you're in a cheap spy novel? Let me tell you something about reality. Reality is not a screen in your hand. Reality is that you are in a court of law, and in this building, I am the law, not your father, not your associates, and certainly not a grainy video on your phone." Varga's smirk faltered for the briefest of seconds. He was used to people cowering. He was used to the world bending around the Varga name, the fear it commanded, and the doors it opened or slammed shut. He wasn't used to a grandmother in a lace collar staring him down without blinking. "You're a guest in my house," I continued, standing up slowly. I walked to the edge of the bench, my hands resting on the wood, locking eyes with him. "And guests who threaten their host are shown the door, or in your case, a holding cell." "Bird." "Yes, Judge." Officer Bird barked, his voice booming. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Varga's hands. "Mr. Varga just mentioned a live feed in my chambers," I said, my gaze never leaving the defendant. "I want the bailiffs to secure the entire wing. No one enters, no one leaves. And I want the IT department to trace that signal. If there is a camera in my office, I want it found, and I want the person holding it prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Varga laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're wasting your time, old woman. By the time you find a signal, my people will have—" "I don't care about your people," I interrupted, slamming my gavel down once not to silence the room, but to punctuate the air. "I care about the audacity of a punk who thinks he can bring his daddy's criminal lifestyle into my courtroom. You aren't just looking at vandalism anymore, Mr. Varga. You are looking at direct, premeditated obstruction of justice and the intimidation of a sitting judge. That is a federal crime." The gallery began to murmur, the sound rising like a tide. Varga looked around, his bravado finally beginning to fray. He had expected me to fold. He had expected me to worry about my car, my dog, my office. He had forgotten that to be a judge, you have to be able to look the devil in the face and not lose your nerve. "You think you're untouchable because you have a famous last name," I said, my voice rising. "Let me educate you. Names mean nothing here. Actions mean everything. And your actions today have earned you a front row seat to the consequences you've spent your whole life avoiding. Officer Bird, keep your eyes on him. If he reaches for that phone one more time, take it. He doesn't need to be communicating with anyone but his lawyer." Varga's face drained of color, his hands clenching into fists on the table. He was cornered, and for the first time, he realized that the cage he was in wasn't just physical, it was legal, and it was closing in fast. The air in the courtroom didn't just feel heavy, it felt electrified, pulsating with the kind of tension that comes right before a structural collapse. Julian Varga was pacing now, a frantic, caged animal energy vibrating off him. He was muttering into his phone, his initial sneering confidence replaced by a twitchy, desperate urgency. He was realizing that in this room, his father's legendary reach the money, the lawyers, the shadows didn't hold the currency he thought it did. I didn't care about the alleged cameras, the threats, or the looming specter of his father's reputation. I had a job to do, and I was going to see it through, regardless of the cost. Mrs. Higgins stood there, her small frame trembling, but her gaze remained fixed on the man who had systematically destroyed her peace of mind. She was the one who truly mattered here. "Mr. Varga," I said, my voice cutting through his frantic mumbling like a scalpel, "you seem terribly distracted. Perhaps you'd like to focus on the reality of the situation you've created?" He stopped pacing and spun around, his face a mask of controlled, manic rage. "You have no idea what you're starting, Judy. My father is not a man who accepts no for an answer. He's already made a call. This entire building is on a list. You're playing with fire." I let a cold, sharp smile touch my lips, ensuring my authority remained absolute and unshaken. "Then he's wasting his breath and his money. Because in this room, the only list that matters is the one I create. And right now, you're at the top of it. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open. The gallery fell into a hush so profound it felt as though the world outside had ceased to exist. It wasn't security, and it wasn't the police. A man walked in, scarred, weathered, wearing an aura of absolute dominance that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. Hector Varga, the kingpin. The man who supposedly commanded armies from his fortified hideouts. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic reminder of the stakes, but I forced my features into a mask of stone. If this was the climax of the case, I was going to hold the line. Julian straightened up, his face lighting up with a sickening, vindictive sense of triumph. "Dad, you're here. Tell her who we are. She's been threatening me." Hector Varga didn't look at his son. He didn't acknowledge the gallery. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing with a terrifying finality, his gaze locked solely on me. He reached the defense table and paused. He looked down at the destruction of the rose bushes displayed in the evidence photos, then back at his son. Julian began to rant. "These people, they disrespected us. She threatened me. Handle it." Hector still didn't move. He reached out, his hand resting heavily on the back of his son's chair. Julian beamed, clearly expecting his father to drag him out of there like a conquering hero, perhaps to level the building on the way out. Instead, the father leaned down, his voice a gravelly, chilling whisper that cut through the silence like a jagged blade. "You idiot," he said, "not to me, but to Julian. You brought this to a courtroom?" The shift was seismic. The room felt even thinner, more fragile. I sat back, my hands folded, watching the hierarchy of power, the very thing this case was built on, crumble in real time. This was not the rescue Julian expected. It was a judgment. Hector Varga didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that looked paternal but felt like a vice. Julian shrank, the color draining from his face, as he realized his father wasn't here to play the enforcer for a petty vandalism charge. He was here because the business had been compromised by his son's idiocy. "Julian," Hector said, his voice smooth, devoid of the jagged edge he used on his rivals, "you have become problematic." The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning unit seemed like a roar. My hand stayed on my gavel, not to use it, but to keep my presence grounded. This was the moment. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had evaporated. I saw the realization hit the audience. The big bad mob boss wasn't here to save his son, he was here to manage the liability. I leaned back, my eyes tracking Hector Varga as he finally turned toward the bench. His eyes were like polished flint, impenetrable. "Judge Judy," he said, and the way he said my name felt like a weight in the room. He wasn't sneering, he was assessing. "My son has a habit of confusing his personal grievances with the family's interests. That is a failure of discipline, not a matter of law." "Mr. Varga," I retorted, not giving him the satisfaction of a tremor in my voice. "In this courtroom, there are no family interests. There is only the law, and currently, your son is in violation of it. He brought threats into this room. He brought a circus to my house. And now, he is looking at serious consequences." Hector looked at me, a flicker of something perhaps grudging respect crossing his eyes. "I understand, and I apologize for the interference. Julian will be handling this differently." He turned back to Julian, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried perfectly to the front row. "You apologize, you pay the damages, and you pray that the judge is feeling lenient." Julian looked as if he'd been slapped. "But Dad," you said. I said nothing. Hector cut him off, his grip tightening on the chair until his knuckles turned white. "You are an adult, Julian. Act like one, or go home and be a child. The choice is yours." I tapped my gavel, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot. "That is enough. Mr. Varga, I appreciate the sentiment, but this case is not over. The destruction of property, the threats made on the record, the attempt to intimidate a member of this court, those are not things that can be swept under the rug with an apology." Hector Varga nodded slowly. "I expect nothing less. Proceed, Your Honor." The room felt like it was holding its breath. The kingpin of the East Coast had effectively bowed to the rules of the court, leaving his son entirely exposed. Julian looked around, desperate, searching for an exit that didn't exist. He had played the untouchable card and had been left with nothing but his own ego to carry home. The silence in the room was surgical, cut only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Hector Varga didn't move. He stood there, his presence radiating an authority that silenced the entire courtroom. It was a privilege collapse in real time, the moment where the protective shell of the Varga name cracked, and the man inside was left exposed not just as a criminal, but as a failure in the eyes of the one person he feared most. "Mr. Varga," I said, my voice steady, refusing to be swayed by the sudden shift in the courtroom's dynamic. "This is not a family counseling session. I do not care about your internal disciplinary measures, and I certainly do not care for your excuses. In this courtroom, there are only the facts, the law, and the people who have been harmed by the arrogance of the man sitting at that table." Hector exhaled, a low, controlled sound that seemed to carry the weight of an empire. He looked at me, not with the defiance his son had shown, but with the weary pragmatism of a man who knew when the game was lost. "You misunderstand me, Your Honor. I am not here to offer excuses. I am here to facilitate justice." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, leather-bound notebook. He didn't hand it to me directly. He placed it firmly on the defense table in front of his son, who flinched as if it were a weapon. "Everything is in here," Hector said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, chilling register. "The logs of property damage, the coordination of the harassment campaigns against Mrs. Higgins, the dates, the times, and the names of the men he hired to do his dirty work. He kept a diary of his endeavors. He thought it made him powerful. It only made him a liability." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Even Officer Byrd looked stunned, his hand relaxing ever so slightly on his belt. Mrs. Higgins let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. I banged my gavel hard. The sound cracked like a whip, instantly stifling the noise. "Quiet. I want order in this court." Julian, the once arrogant prince of the underworld, looked as though he had been physically struck. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a boy caught in a lie he couldn't outrun. "Dad, you can't be serious," he stammered, his voice thin and cracking. "You said you'd take care of this. You said—" "I said silence," Hector commanded, and the word fell with the finality of a prison door slamming shut. The room fell into an eerie, suffocating hush. Julian sat back, his head hanging low, the bravado of the opening session completely shattered. I looked down at the notebook on the table. It was the evidence collapse moment I had been waiting for, a stark, undeniable truth that no lawyer could spin, no influence could erase. "Mr. Varga," I addressed the father, "you are voluntarily surrendering evidence of your son's criminal activities?" "It is not evidence of my activities, Your Honor," Hector said, his eyes hard and unyielding. "It is merely the ledger of a boy who forgot that there are rules even we must respect. He broke them. Now he must face the consequences." He turned to his son, his expression devoid of the warmth one usually expects from a father. "You wanted to play the role of a king, Julian, but a king must have the wisdom to govern, not just the cruelty to destroy. You have neither. You are a liability. And in our world, liabilities are discarded." The moral arc of the case was clear. It was no longer about a car or a garden. It was about the crushing reality that power, when used to feed an ego, inevitably destroys the one who wields it. The notebook lay on the bench, a simple piece of leather binding that held the weight of 1,000 crimes. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the meticulous entries. It was all there. The dates of the harassment, the times he had instructed his lackeys to slash tires or spray paint property, and even the calculated costs of the damage he'd inflicted on Mrs. Higgins and others in the neighborhood. Julian Varga had treated the destruction of people's lives like a ledger for his own personal amusement. He hadn't just been a bully, he had been a budding architect of chaos, fueled by the toxic belief that his surname made him immune to the basic laws of civilization. The courtroom was deathly quiet. You could hear the hum of the ventilation system, the frantic, shallow breathing of the defendant, and the collective anticipation of the gallery. This wasn't just a small claims case anymore. The evidence provided by the father had effectively torched the son's entire defense. Julian looked at the notebook, his face pale, his lips trembling. He reached for it, but Officer Byrd was faster, stepping into his path, hand resting firmly on the holstered taser. Julian recoiled, his confidence shattered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. "You don't understand," he wheezed, his voice stripped of all its venom. "He's doing this because he's angry. It's a trick. He's trying to punish me." I stared at him, my expression impassive. "No, Mr. Varga, He's doing what any parent, mob boss or not, eventually does when they realize their legacy is being squandered by a fool. He's cutting his losses. You aren't a victim here. You are an expense. And you've just been written off the balance sheet. I turned my attention to the gallery, to the people whose lives had been upended by this boy's whims. They weren't cheering. They were watching, stunned by the sheer gravity of the moment. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes, it comes with the quiet thud of a heavy book hitting a table. I looked down at Mrs. Higgins. She was holding her handbag, knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the man who had terrified her. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the last hour, but beneath the fatigue, there was a glimmer of something else. Peace. The fear that had kept her awake at night was beginning to dissipate. Mrs. Higgins, I said, my voice softening just enough to convey the gravity of my respect for her resilience. You have done more for your community today than any police report or filed complaint ever could. You refused to be silenced, and because of that, this notebook exists. Do not think for a second that your struggle went unnoticed. I shifted my gaze back to Julian. The prince was officially a pauper in every sense of the word. He was alone, his support system gone, and the weight of his actions finally settling onto his shoulders. Officer Byrd, I said, my voice returning to its sharp, judicial edge. Take the defendant into custody. I want this notebook processed and turned over to the prosecutor's office. I don't care if it's a civil matter or a criminal one anymore. The evidence of these systematic threats is now a matter of public record. Julian Varga is no longer your problem. He belongs to the system now. As Byrd handcuffed him, Julian didn't fight back. He didn't scream, didn't threaten, didn't demand his father's help. He just looked down, a broken figure in a suit that suddenly felt too big for him. The privilege he had worn like a suit of armor had been stripped away, leaving behind nothing but the man, and the man was small, fragile, and entirely ordinary. It was the ultimate humiliation, and it was entirely deserved.